Hey everyone, welcome back to Music Appreciation. Today we are looking at Chapter 18, which covers the Fugue in G minor by the composer J.S. Bach. Returning again to our music history timeline, so far we have discussed music from the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and beginning this week we started talking about the Baroque era, which spans the years approximately 1600 to 1750. And music historians chose 1750 as the cutoff point for the Baroque era because that's actually the year that our composer for today, Bach, that's the year that he died. So that tells us quite a bit about his importance and significance during this Baroque era. To refresh our memories, we defined the Baroque era. The name comes from the Portuguese word barroco, which means misshapen pearl, so that implies something that is both beautiful, yet also slightly distorted. So originally used as sort of an insulting, derogatory term for something that was kind of over the top or a little bit too much, a little too gaudy. And you might actually get that sense listening to the fugue today. It is quite dense, there's a lot going on, but hopefully you also think it's quite beautiful. So some background on our composer, Johann Sebastian Bach. He lived from 1685 to 1750, and he was a German composer of the Baroque era. He is probably the best known Baroque composer. You're surely familiar with some of his works. They're used all the time in movies and television and commercials. And he actually comes from a very large musical family. His father and several of his sons were very well-known musicians who were quite renowned during their time. And Bach's music has kind of lived on today as a staple of the Western classical canon. So he served two roles for most of his life as a professional composer. He worked both as a court composer and also as a church Kapellmeister, which is the German word for music leader. So during this time period, if you were a professional composer or a professional classical musician, you basically had the choice to either work for the royal courts or to work for the church. And so Bach did a little bit of both of these things. So in his role as a court composer, he would work within the court itself at the behest of his noble patron, writing mostly secular music for kind of entertainment purposes. And for the church, he would be writing, of course, sacred vocal music for worship services in the Lutheran Church. So today we'll be looking at a piece that would have been written for a solo instrument. It's a piece of secular music called the fugue. And this is a genre that became popular in the Baroque era and was really truly mastered by Bach. He's considered to be sort of the master of the fugue genre. So a fugue, the name itself gives us a clue as to its structure. Fugue sound is sort of the same root word as fugitive, for example, which implies that you have some sort of chase happening. A fugitive, of course, is on the run, being chased. So we get that similar sense here. In this case, we have a main theme, which we'll call the subject, and that is this recurring melody that always seems to be kind of chasing or to be chased throughout the piece. It constantly returns in different forms and variations and transformations, and sort of builds upon this very simple melody. So this is a polyphonic genre, meaning once again in terms of texture that we have multiple melodic lines, each equally important, happening at the same time. In the case of this fugue in G minor, we actually have 4 separate melodic lines happening simultaneously. So it is quite a dense texture. There's a lot going on at all times. And keep in mind that this would have been performed by one single person at the same time, in this case, an organist. So here's kind of our recipe for a fugue. We've got 3 main sections in the music. Each fugue will begin first with an exposition, and this is when our subject or our main melody is first introduced to you as the listener. So it's called an exposition because at this point the subject is being exposed. Following that, we'll have alternations of middle entries and episodes. So middle entries are sections where the subject returns, but it's always going to be in a sort of varied form. And on the next couple slides, I'll play you some examples of how that might happen. Interspersed with that, we'll hear brief episodes of new sections, new material without the subject. So it's a pretty straightforward format here, looking at this listening guide. Here I've listed the forms in terms of section, and here I've listed what melody you'll be hearing. So first off, we start with the exposition, and after that we just alternate new material, recurring variations on the subject, new material, variations on the subject, new material, variations on the subject, etc., etc. So pretty straightforward there. So to introduce us to this particular fugue in G minor by Bach, I've laid out right here the subject or the main melody. So grab my violin, and I'm going to play this through for you really quickly so you can get this subject in your ear. It's pretty simple, a little bit catchy, it's kind of fun, it's supposed to be memorable. So I'll play these first two lines. Alright, so that's it. That's the main tune you'll be listening for. And I put this line here to delineate these first two measures, and this is really, I think, the most memorable part. This is really essentially the soul or the heart of this subject. So I'm going to play it one more time so that you've got it firmly in your ear. There we go. So keep that in mind, and now let's next discuss how we might vary or transform this pretty simple subject to add variation and interest for our middle entries. So here I've listed a couple of options for our subject. If we're going to keep returning to it over and over again throughout the fugue, then we need to do something interesting with it. So a couple of our options would be to play it backwards, which is called a retrograde. We could play it upside down, which is an inversion. And that literally is like if you were to flip the sheet of music upside down and read it that way, that's what that means. A retrograde inversion, so you could play it upside down and read it from right to left, read it backwards. You can slow it down with an augmentation, or you can speed it up with a diminution. So a couple examples of that. Let me return here to the subject. So you've already heard it a couple times, so you know what the original sounds like. Now let me play it in retrograde for you. So of course normally you'd read it left to right, so now I'm going to read it right to left. So it has the similar sort of sound and feel as the original subject, but it also sounds kind of different in a complementary way. And if you compare that to the original, hopefully you can kind of hear the relationship there. So that's one option for us. We can also play it upside down, inverted upside down. So I'll return here and I'll play that for you. Okay, our next option is, a retrograde inversion, so backwards and upside down, quite distorted. Play that for you next. And finally, we can either slow it down or speed it up. So I could play it at half tempo, twice as slow. Or I can play it twice as fast. So that's a list of some options for our middle entries, and that will add some interest. So again, we'll hear the first subject, and then after that, we'll just kind of play around with it and layer each one of these different variations on top of one another to create a really interesting texture, polyphonic texture. All right, so now I'm going to switch to a video here. And this is a great video because it's actually a nice sort of visual illustration of a polyphonic texture. So for each line of in our polyphonic texture, we've got 4 lines. Each melody will be shown in a different color. So you'll be able to get a visual representation of just how dense this polyphonic texture is. Okay. Now here comes our second melodic line. Same subject repeated once again. Now here comes our third melodic line. Now here's our 4th line in the purple. So we've just finished the exposition, and now we're entering into an episode, which means new material without the subject. But right there, we switch back to a middle entry. All right, so I'm going to pause that there and let you listen to it on your own time. But I think the visuals on this video really help represent this polyphonic texture. So there's a lot going on, and again, it's one single person playing this 4 melodies at the same time, so quite virtuosic. This style, this fugue, is also an interesting genre because it lends itself to different kind of arrangements. Since we have 4 lines in this polyphonic texture, you could conceivably oops, sorry, wrong video. You could conceivably give 1 line to an individual musician and have a quartet play it all at the same time. And that's certainly something that would have happened during Bach's time as well. So a good example of this here is a guitar quartet. So each person takes 1 single melody and creates an entire composition together. So I'll listen to a brief portion of this as well. Okay, so I'll pause that there as well. And I've added all of these videos to our class playlist down here, which is linked in on our Blackboard page, so definitely check these out. I've also included a video, I won't play it now, of a live performance of this piece on the organ if you want to actually see what that entails. It's pretty cool. And there's also a video included that explains how the organ actually works. It's a pretty intricate instrument, so sort of additional materials there if you'd like to check them out. All right, so that ends our discussion about the fugue. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for listening.